The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the great hall, seeping through the thin soles of her worn-out shoes and into the bones of her feet. It clung to the damp rags she used to scrub away the grime of the silverwood pack, turning her knuckles a raw, weeping red. They called her Alara, but most of the time they did not call her anything at all. She was a ghost in her own home, a shadow meant to be overlooked. Worthless. The word was a brand on her soul, far more painful than the chill that had settled deep in her marrow. She was an Omega, the lowest of the low, an orphan left behind when her parents had been slain by rogues years ago. With no family to protect her, she had become the pack's property, a convenient target for every frustration and a silent worker for every menial task. A bucket of icy water sloshed beside her, the splash soaking the hem of her already threadbare tunic. Alara flinched but did not look up. She knew who it was without seeing. Lyra, the Alpha's daughter, stood over her, a cruel smirk twisting her pretty face. "Filth breeds filth, Omega," Lyra purred, her voice dripping with condescension. "You missed a spot." She nudged a perfectly clean flagstone with the toe of her fur-lined boot. Alara's jaw tightened. She bowed her head, the curtain of her dull brown hair hiding the spark of defiance in her eyes. "Yes, Lyra, my apologies." Her voice was a mouse squeak, exactly what was expected of her. "See that you do better." Lyra kicked the wooden bucket, sending it skittering across the floor. Soapy, frigid water flooded the area Alara had just finished cleaning. "The Alpha King Kalen arrives for the winter choosing in 2 days. This hall must be perfect. His standards are not as low as yours." The mention of the Alpha King sent a fresh wave of dread through Alara's stomach, colder than any spilled water. The winter choosing was a ceremony where the supreme alpha of all packs would sometimes, though rarely, find his fated mate among the eligible daughters of his vassal alphas. For Lyra and the other high-ranking females, it was a time of breathless anticipation. For Alara, it meant more work, more chances to be underfoot, more opportunities for humiliation. She did not reply. She simply retrieved the bucket, her movements slow and deliberate, and began the work of soaking up the spill. Her silence was her only armor. They could break her body, but she would not give them the satisfaction of breaking her spirit. Not completely. Inside, where no one could see, she was not just an Omega. She was the daughter of Mara and Phelan, warriors who had died protecting the pack that now spat on their only child. She held their memory like a secret, warming ember in the frozen landscape of her life. It was not much, but it was hers. The blizzard hit on the eve of the king's arrival, a monster of wind and snow that descended from the northern peaks without warning. The world beyond the great hall's windows turned into a churning vortex of white. The wind howled like a starving wolf, clawing at the stone walls. It was Lyra, of course, who found a reason to send her out into it. "The frost herbs for the ceremonial incense," Lyra announced, her voice ringing with false authority. "We have none left. You, Omega, you know the woods. Go and fetch them from the elder pine grove." It was a death sentence. The elder pine grove was a half-hour's trek in good weather. In this storm, it was a frozen hell from which no one could expect to return. The pack's alpha, Lyra's father, said nothing. He watched, his face a mask of indifference, as his daughter sent a pack member to her certain doom. No one spoke up for her. Why would they? She was just Alara. Dressed in a cloak that was little more than patched rags, Alara stepped out of the great hall and into the maw of the storm. The wind stole her breath instantly, a physical blow that staggered her. Snow, sharp as sand, blasted her face. Within moments, the towering shape of the pack hall was swallowed by the white chaos. She was alone. She gritted her teeth, a familiar, stubborn gesture. She would not die. She would not give Lyra the satisfaction. She lowered her head and pushed forward, one agonizing step at a time, her only guide the faint memory of the path and the feel of the rising ground beneath her feet. The world became a blur of white and a screaming symphony of wind. Her body grew numb, the biting cold giving way to a dangerous, deceptive warmth in her extremities. She knew she was losing. The grove was nowhere in sight. She was lost. Was this how it ended? A frozen, forgotten corpse buried under a mountain of snow? The thought brought a fresh surge of rage. No. She stumbled onward, fueled by nothing but pure, spiteful will. Then the ground vanished. One moment she was on solid earth, the next she was falling. A scream tore from her throat, swallowed by the storm. She tumbled down a steep, rocky ravine, her body hitting sharp edges and frozen roots. Pain exploded in her ankle, a sickening crunch that shot fire up her leg. She landed in a deep snowdrift at the bottom, the impact knocking the last of the air from her lungs. For a long moment she lay there, gasping, stars bursting behind her eyes. The pain in her ankle was a sharp, white-hot agony. She was trapped, broken. The storm raged above the lip of the ravine, a distant roar now. Down here, it was eerily quiet. The cold was already seeping back in, more aggressive than before. Despair, thick and suffocating, washed over her. Lyra had won. But then, through the haze of pain and cold, she smelled it. Pine, yes, but something else. Something metallic and hot. Blood. And beneath that, a scent she had never encountered but recognized on a primal level. Predator, power, and winter storms. It was the scent of a wolf, but more, so much more. Ignoring the fire in her ankle, she began to crawl. She dragged her useless leg behind her, her raw hands digging into the snow. The scent grew stronger, pulling her forward like a rope. It led her to a shallow overhang, a small cave carved into the rock face of the ravine. A low growl rumbled from the darkness within. It was not a threat. It was a sound of pure agony. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but where could she go? She was dying anyway. Pushing aside a curtain of snow-dusted ferns, she peered inside. Her breath hitched. Lying on the cave floor was a man. He was massive, a giant of muscle and broad shoulders, clad in dark, torn leathers. His black hair was matted with snow and blood. A deep, vicious gash ran across his ribs, staining the ground beneath him a dark crimson. Even in the dim light, she could see that his face was all harsh angles and predatory beauty, now pale and drawn with pain. But it was the scene around him that made her freeze. 3 bodies lay scattered in the snow near the cave mouth. Rogues. Their feral scent was thick in the air, a sour counterpoint to the power emanating from the wounded man. Their throats had been torn out with brutal efficiency. He had fought them. He had won. But it had cost him dearly. He was dying, just like her. Suddenly, a flicker of movement. One of the rogues was not dead. He was pushing himself up, a broken knife in his hand, his yellow eyes filled with a last, desperate surge of malice. The massive man on the ground tried to move, a guttural snarl tearing from his chest, but he was too weak. His eyes, which had flickered open to reveal a startling pale silver, were clouded with pain. The rogue staggered toward him, knife raised. Alara did not think. She did not plan. The stubborn, resilient thing inside her that had refused to break for Lyra now erupted. She launched herself forward, a feral scream ripping from her own throat. She was a thing of desperation and fury. She slammed into the rogue from the side, knocking him off balance. He was bigger, stronger, but he was wounded and surprised. He snarled, swiping at her with the knife. She scrambled back, her hands finding a heavy, jagged rock. She threw it with all her might, striking him in the temple. He howled, dropping the knife. Before he could recover, she was on him. She was all teeth and nails, a wild thing fighting for a life that was not even her own. Why was she doing this? She did not know. She only knew that the man in the cave could not die. Another rogue, one she had thought dead, stirred, groaning. He began to crawl toward the fight, his eyes locking on her. 2 of them. Panic and adrenaline surged through her in a dizzying wave. She kicked the first rogue away and snatched up the fallen knife. It felt clumsy in her hand. The second rogue lunged and she stumbled back on her good leg, her injured ankle screaming in protest. She swung the knife wildly, the blade slicing across his arm. He roared, undeterred, and grabs her by the throat, his claws digging into her skin. Her vision started to blacken at the edges. Choking, she drove her knee into his groin. He grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She twisted, bringing the knife up and under his ribs with a desperate 2-handed shove. He gasped, a wet, gurgling sound, and collapsed on top of her. Shoving his dead weight off, she scrambled to face the first rogue. He was on his feet again, blood streaming down his face, his eyes burning with hate. He charged. There was no time for finesse, no time for fear. She met his charge head-on, ducking under his grasping hands and driving the hilt of the knife into his throat. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. He staggered back, clutching his neck, and fell into the snow, silent. It was over. Silence descended, broken only by her own ragged, sobbing breaths and the howl of the wind above. She stood there, trembling, covered in blood that was not hers, the knife falling from her nerveless fingers. She had done it. She had killed them. Worthless, invisible Alara had killed 2 rogue wolves, bare-handed, or close enough. A weak cough came from the cave. She turned, her wild adrenaline crashing into exhaustion. The massive man was watching her. His eyes, no longer clouded, were a clear, piercing silver, and they held an expression of stunned, profound disbelief. He had seen it all. The last of her strength deserted her. The world tilted, and she collapsed into the snow. The darkness she had held at bay finally claiming her. She woke to a searing heat. It was not the biting cold of the snow, but a deep, internal fire that seemed to originate from her wrist. A groggy, pained noise escaped her lips. She was no longer in the snow. She was inside the cave, lying on a thick fur cloak that smelled of pine and winter storms. The wounded man was beside her, propped against the cave wall. The fire she had managed to start before she passed out was now a steady, healthy blaze. He had dragged her inside. He had saved her. "You're awake," a voice rumbled, deep as thunder. She flinched, her eyes flying to his. They were still silver, but now they held a strange intensity, a focus that made her feel naked and seen in a way she never had before. He had cleaned and bound his own wound with strips of cloth torn from his tunic. He was still pale, but the immediate threat of death seemed to have receded. You were, she stammered, her voice hoarse. Dying, he finished for her. You stopped that. He looked from her face to the bodies outside the cave, then back again. There was no praise in his voice, only a quiet, assessing statement of fact. The cold was starting to creep back into her bones, despite the fire. She shivered, wrapping her thin cloak tighter around herself. The man watched her, his brow furrowed. After a moment of silence, he shifted, a grunt of pain escaping him. "Come here," he commanded. It was not a request. Fear, sharp and immediate, pierced through her exhaustion. He was an unknown, a massive predator who had just slaughtered 3 of his own kind, and she was a lone, injured Omega. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. His expression did not change, but something in his silver eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "You are freezing. I am not. Sharing body heat is the most efficient way to survive. I will not harm you." Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to stay as far away as possible, but her body, shivering uncontrollably, betrayed her. The logic was sound, and more than that, a strange, inexplicable pull emanated from him, a sense of safety that defied all reason. Hesitantly, she crawled closer, dragging her throbbing ankle. She settled beside him, careful not to touch him, the heat radiating from his large body a siren's call to her frozen limbs. "Closer," he said, his voice softer now, but just as absolute. "This is pointless otherwise." She took a shaky breath and shifted again, her shoulder brushing against his arm. The contact was like a lightning strike. A gasp was torn from her lips, but it was nothing compared to what happened next. His hand, large and calloused, moved to steady her, his fingers wrapping around her wrist to keep her from pulling away. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded. A blinding, white-hot light erupted behind her eyes. A searing pain, 1,000 times hotter than the fire, shot up her arm from her wrist. She screamed, a raw, agonized sound. It felt as if a blacksmith's brand was being pressed into her flesh, burning not just her skin, but her very soul. Through the agony, she felt an overwhelming flood of him. Loneliness, ancient and vast as a glacier, the crushing weight of duty, a desperate, centuries-long ache for something he had never found, and beneath it all, a sudden, explosive surge of recognition and triumph. The pain coalesced, focusing on her wrist, and then it was gone, leaving a tingling electric warmth in its wake. She lay gasping against him, her body trembling from the shock. She dared to look down at her wrist. There, on her pale skin, was a mark. It was intricate and glowing with a soft golden light, a swirling pattern that looked like a snarling wolf's head intertwined with a radiant, 7-pointed star. It was beautiful and terrifying. What was happening to me? She looked up at the man, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. His face was a mask of shock, but his eyes were no longer silver. They were blazing molten gold, glowing with an inner light that was not a reflection of the fire. He stared at the mark on her wrist, then at her face, and a look of profound, earth-shattering awe dawned in his expression. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the glowing symbol. His touch no longer burned. It sent a cascade of warmth and a strange sense of rightness through her veins. "You're her," he breathed, the words a reverent whisper. The sound vibrated through her, settling deep in her bones. Her mind recoiled in fear. Her? Her who? What did he mean? This was madness, some kind of storm-induced fever dream. I don't understand, she whispered, trying to pull her wrist away. His grip tightened, not painfully, but with an immovable possessiveness. His molten gold eyes locked onto hers, and the universe seemed to narrow to the space between them. Mine, he growled. The word was not a claim of ownership in the way her pack owned her. It was deeper, a statement of fact, of destiny, of a connection so profound it defied words. It was the sound of a lock finding its key after 1,000 years. Before she could process the impossible word, the monumental weight of his declaration, his golden eyes fluttered shut. The light within them faded. His head slumped forward, and his full weight sagged against her. The exertion, his wounds, and the shock of the bond had finally overwhelmed him. He had passed out. Alara was left in the flickering firelight, trapped beneath the arm of a terrifying giant man, a glowing mark burned into her skin, and a single impossible word echoing in the ruins of her world. Mine. She did not know how long she sat there, pinned by his weight, her mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. The glowing mark on her wrist was undeniable, a tangible piece of insanity. Her body, pressed against his, no longer felt the cold. A group of warriors, clad in the same dark leathers and heavy gray furs as the king, appeared at the mouth of the ravine. They moved with the silent, deadly grace of apex predators. His royal guard, the winter wolves. Their leader, a grim-faced man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, took in the scene at the cave mouth. The dead rogues, the trail of blood, and finally, the sight within the cave. His eyes widened, first at his king, then at the terrified Omega huddled with him. "Secure the area!" he barked at his men. He slid down the embankment and approached the cave cautiously. His eyes fell on Alara's wrist, where the mark was still faintly glowing. His jaw went slack. The hard warrior's face transformed, his expression shifting from suspicion to utter, reverent awe. He dropped to one knee in the snow. "Luna," he breathed. The word meant nothing and everything. It was a title of legend, the name given to the fated mate of the Alpha King, a position that had been empty for 500 years. Alara stared at him, her fear giving way to a dizzying wave of confusion. Luna? Her? The worthless Omega? It was impossible. It was a mistake. They transported them from the ravine with a gentleness Alara had never experienced. The king was carried on a makeshift litter, still unconscious. Alara, despite her protest that she could walk, was lifted into the arms of a huge warrior who handled her as if she were made of spun glass. Her ankle was expertly splinted and bound. They did not take them to the Silverwood Pack Hall, but to a sprawling temporary encampment of black and gray tents that had been erected in a shelter. A young woman with kind eyes brought Alara a bowl of hot stew, a fresh tunic of soft wool, and a basin of warm water. "Thank you," Alara whispered, overwhelmed. The woman bowed her head. "It is an honor, Luna." Alara flinched at the title. "Please, don't call me that. My name is Alara." The woman simply smiled, a knowing, gentle expression, and retreated from the tent. Alara ate the stew, the first truly hot meal she had had in years. It was rich with meat and herbs, and it sent warmth flooding through her. She scrubbed the blood and grime from her face and hands, her gaze repeatedly falling to the mark on her wrist. The glow had faded, but the intricate lines of the wolf and star were etched into her skin, a permanent, dark gray tracery. She pulled the long sleeve of the new tunic down over it, hiding it from view. It felt like hiding a stolen jewel. Later, a message came. The king was stable. He was asking for her. Her heart leaped into her throat. Led by the scarred commander, whose name she learned was Gunnar, she was brought to the king's bedside. Kaelin was awake, propped up against a pile of furs. His color was better, and the molten gold had receded from his eyes, leaving them that piercing, clear silver once more. But the intensity was still there. The moment she entered the tent, his gaze locked on her, and the rest of the world ceased to exist. "Leave us," he commanded his guards. Gunnar bowed and ushered the healers out, closing the tent flap behind them. They were alone. The silence was thick with unspoken things. "Come here," Kaelin said again. This time she obeyed, her feet moving as if of their own accord. She stopped by his bedside, her hands clenched at her sides, her gaze fixed on the fur blanket. She could not bring herself to meet his eyes. "You're afraid," he stated. She nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. "You are the Alpha King. I am an Omega. I touched you. I shouldn't have." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "You did more than touch me, little wolf. You saved my life. And then this happened." He gently took her hand and pushed back the sleeve, revealing the mark. His thumb traced the lines, sending that same shiver of warmth through her. "Do you know what this is?" They called me Luna," she whispered, the word tasting foreign and absurd on her tongue. "They are correct," he said simply. "This is a soul bond mark. It appears only when a king finds his fated mate, a mate I have waited centuries for, a mate I had begun to believe did not exist." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No, it's a mistake. I'm nobody. I'm worthless. The pack, everyone says so." The words tumbled out, a confession of her deepest, most painful truth. Kaelin's expression hardened, a dangerous light entering his silver eyes. "The pack that sent you into a death storm for herbs? The pack that let you starve and freeze while they were warm in their hall." His voice was low, laced with a terrifying fury not directed at her, but for her. "They are the ones who are worthless, not you. Never you." He watched her, his gaze softening again. "I saw you. In that ravine. You were injured, terrified, and freezing to death, but you fought. Not like a trained warrior, but like a cornered wolf protecting its own. You have more fire in you than my entire royal guard. Do not ever call yourself worthless again." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever seen her. Not the real her, the one who fought to survive every day. "Sit down," he said, his voice gentle now. He patted the edge of the furs. She hesitated, then perched on the side of the bed. "Tell me your name." "Alara." "Alara," he repeated, tasting the name. "I am Kaelin." He held her gaze, his expression serious. "This will be confusing, frightening. Your life has been turned upside down. But know this. You are no longer an Omega of the Silverwood Pack. You are mine, and you are safe." The promise was absolute. Part of her, the part that had been alone for so long, desperately wanted to believe him. But the other part, the part that had been taught its own worthlessness for a decade, could only feel a deep, abiding terror. This was too much, too fast. A commotion outside the tent interrupted the fragile moment. Gunner's voice could be heard, low and sharp, arguing with someone. The tent flap was thrown open, and Alpha Valerius of the Silverwood Pack strode in, his daughter Lyra trailing smugly behind him. Valerius's eyes widened at the sight of Alara sitting on the king's bed. Lyra's painted lips tightened into a venomous line. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, bowing low, "1,000 apologies for the intrusion. We came to offer our profound relief at your recovery. We were horrified to hear of the rogue attack." He shot a poisonous glare at Alara. "And to retrieve our wayward Omega. She will be punished severely for running off and troubling your people." Before Alara could flinch, before she could retreat into her shell of invisibility, Kaelin's hand shot out and clamped around her wrist, his thumb resting protectively over the soul bond mark. His eyes, when he looked at Valerius, were not silver. They were chips of ice. "She is not your Omega," Kaelin said, his voice lethally soft. "And you will not touch her. Alara is under my protection." Lyra gasped, her eyes flying to where Kaelin held Alara's hand. She saw the edge of the dark mark peeking out from under his thumb. Her face, a mask of pretty arrogance moments before, contorted with a flash of pure, unadulterated jealousy. It was quickly hidden, replaced by a calculating gleam. She looked from the mark to Alara's terrified face, and a slow, venomous smile touched her lips. She had not lost. The game had just changed. This worthless Omega was not an obstacle anymore. She was a key. Lyra's discovery hung in the air, a toxic, unspoken secret. Kaelin dismissed Alpha Valerius and his daughter with a curt, non-negotiable command, his icy displeasure a palpable force in the tent. Valerius, cowed and confused, practically dragged Lyra out. But Alara had seen the look in Lyra's eyes. It was the look of a predator that had just spotted a new, more interesting way to hunt. The fear that had momentarily receded came flooding back. "She saw it," Alara whispered, her voice trembling. "Lyra saw the mark." "Let her," Kaelin said, his voice a low growl. His grip on her wrist was a comforting anchor in the swirling storm of her emotions. "Her games are over. She has no power here." But Alara knew better. Lyra's power did not come from strength, but from spite. It was the power of a snake, all venom and slyness. She had tormented Alara for years, for no reason other than petty cruelty. Now, she had a reason, a monumental one. Over the next day, Alara was kept close to the king's side as he recovered with supernatural speed. She was introduced to his inner circle, the stern-faced commanders of his winter wolves. They treated her with a formal, baffled reverence that was almost as unnerving as the open hostility of her old pack. They called her Luna, and each time she felt like an imposter in a stolen life. She learned about the bond. It was a legend, a connection that not only bound two souls but also anchored the Alpha King's immense power to the life force of the land itself. Without a mate, the king's power, while vast, was a solitary, slowly eroding mountain. With his Luna, it became a living, breathing part of the world, renewed and magnified. It was why he had been waiting for so long, why his enemies would see his mate as both a strength and a weakness. Kaelin explained this to her patiently, his silver eyes watching her for any sign of distress. He spoke of his loneliness, of the crushing weight of centuries spent ruling alone. His vulnerability was a disarming weapon, chipping away at the walls she had built around her heart. "I did not know what I was looking for," he confessed one evening as they sat by the brazier. "Only that a part of my soul was missing. The moment our skin touched, I knew. It was you." She wanted to believe him, desperately. But a decade of being told she was nothing was a powerful poison. How could she, Alara, be the missing piece to this ancient, powerful being? It felt like a cruel joke the universe was playing on her. Her self-doubt was a constant, gnawing whisper. She was not a Luna. She was a girl who scrubbed floors. She was not a queen. She was an orphan who hid from beatings. "I don't think so," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. Lyra's smile faltered. "Don't be a fool, Omega. You can't hide behind the king forever. Come now." When Alara did not move, Lyra's patience snapped. She made a sharp, almost imperceptible gesture with her hand. From the shadows behind the neighboring tents, figures emerged. They were not winter wolves. They were clad in black-studded leather that seemed to drink the light, their faces obscured by cowls. Their scent was wrong, acrid smoke and old blood. Before the royal guards could react, the newcomers attacked. The fight was brutal and short. The assassins moved with unnatural speed, their blades coated in a black, viscous substance. The two guards fell, their bodies convulsing. Alara screamed, scrambling to the back of the tent. The bond flared in her chest, a silent, desperate cry for Kaelin. Two of the cowled figures entered the tent. One of them held up a pair of heavy, ornate manacles. They were not iron. They were wrought from a dull, grayish metal that seemed to deaden the air around it. Silver. The moment she saw them, a primal, instinctual terror seized her. The wolf within, a part of herself she barely knew she possessed, howled in fear. Silver was poison. It dampened magic. It burned their kind. And to a bond as new and powerful as hers, it would be agony. they lunged for her. She fought back, kicking and scratching, the ghost of her desperate battle in the ravine rising within her. But she was no match for them. They were too strong, too fast. One of them grabbed her arms, and the other snapped the silver manacles onto her wrists. Pain, blinding and absolute, exploded through her. It was 1,000 times worse than the formation of the bond. It was a cold, soul-deep fire, a shriek of agony that echoed through the link to Kaelin. The humming connection between them, which had become a constant, comforting presence, was violently choked, stretched thin like a screaming wire. She felt a distant, phantom roar of his rage and pain, a mirror of her own, and then the connection began to fray. Her strength vanished. The world dissolved into a gray haze of torment. She was vaguely aware of being dragged from the tent, of Lyra watching with a triumphant sneer on her face. Then a black hood was thrown over her head, and she knew no more. She awoke in darkness, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature seeping into her soul. She was chained to a wall, the silver manacles on her wrists a source of constant, agonizing pain. The bond was a faint, throbbing thread, a whisper of connection in a void of despair. Each breath was a struggle, the silver leeching her strength, her will, her very life force. She was in a cell, carved from black, volcanic rock that felt slick and oily to the touch. The air smelled of sulfur and dark magic. Footsteps echoed outside her cell. A heavy door scraped open, spilling dim, red light into the darkness. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was tall and elegant, dressed in robes of black and ember red. He moved with a liquid grace, and shadows seemed to cling to him, writhing at his feet like loyal pets. "So," the man said, his voice a cultured, resonant baritone that did nothing to hide the chilling lack of warmth beneath. "This is the little spark that has our great king so distressed." He stepped into the cell, and Alara shrank back against the wall. His face was unnervingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that were a startling, unnatural shade of violet. This was not a wolf. He was something else. Something older and darker. "I am Lord Malachor," he said, as if introducing himself at a courtly function. "And you, my dear, are the key to a new era." He paced before her, his movements like those of a panther. "You see, the Alpha King's power is a magnificent, ancient thing, but it has a flaw. It must be grounded. For centuries it has been grounded only in himself, a solitary mountain. But the soul bond, the bond with his fated mate, it changes the nature of that power. It grounds him in the very life of the world, making him exponentially stronger." Malachor stopped and looked at her, a cold smile playing on his lips. "But a bond can be a vulnerability. A chain can be pulled from either end. By taking you, we not only deny him his new strength, we create a wound in his very soul, a wound that bleeds power." He gestured to the silver manacles. "This silver, mined from a place where the earth's magic has died, is not just painful. It is actively suppressing the bond, poisoning it. Every moment you are here, his power drains away, seeping into the ether. Power which he spread his hands, and the shadows in the room deepened, am more than happy to collect." Despair, cold and absolute, washed over Alara. So this was it. She was not just a hostage. She was a weapon, being used against the one person who had ever shown her kindness. Her worthlessness was a contagion, poisoning even an Alpha King. "He will come for you, of course," Malachor continued, his voice laced with amusement. "He will be enraged, blind, and weakened. He will walk right into my fortress, and here I am the master. Once I have broken him, I will perform a small ritual. I will sever this inconvenient bond, and in the backlash, I will claim the power of the Alpha King as my own. The Ember Covenant will rise, and the Age of Wolves will end. He leaned in close, his violet eyes boring into hers. And you, little Omega? You will have the honor of being the catalyst, the worthless girl who brought down a king. His words were a physical blow, striking at the deepest core of her insecurities. Worthless. The word echoed in the silent, screaming space where her bond with Kaelin used to be. Lyra had been right. Her pack had been right. She brought ruin to everything she touched. Malachor left her in the suffocating darkness, the echo of his laughter slithering in the air. She hung from her chains, the silver burning away her strength and her hope. The faint thread of the bond was all she had left. It was a thin, fraying cord of shared agony. She could feel Kaelin's frantic, desperate search for her, a panicked rage that was muted and distant, as if from across an ocean. She was going to die here, and worse, she was going to be the reason he died too. The tears that came were not hot, but cold and silent. They were tears of utter, soul-crushing despair. She let her head hang, the last of her fight draining away. She was ready to let the darkness take her. Hold on. The voice was not a sound. It was a feeling, a spark of golden light in the vast, screaming emptiness of her mind. It was him. It was Kaelin, his will a battering ram against the poison of the silver. Alara, hold on. The connection was faint, fraught with static and pain, but it was there. It was a raw, primal command, imbued with all his desperate fury and terror for her. I am coming. The promise was a lifeline, a tiny, flickering ember in the absolute cold of her despair. It was not enough to fight, not enough to break free, but it was enough to breathe. It was enough to wait. Hope, fierce and desperate, ignited in the ruins of her heart. She lifted her head in the darkness, and for the first time she focused on the bond, not as a source of pain, but as a beacon. She held on to that thin, golden thread with everything she had left. Kaelin, she whispered back into the void, a prayer of pure will. Hurry. The ritual began. Malachor's acolytes, the cowled figures from the camp, dragged her from the cell and into a vast, cavernous chamber. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur and ozone. A complex circle of runes was carved into the floor, glowing with a malevolent red light. At its center was a black stone altar. They chained her to it, the silver manacles now connected to the runic circle itself. Lord Malachor stood before the altar, his arms raised. "The king is at the gates!" he proclaimed, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Weakened and foolish, just as I predicted. Let him witness the moment of his unmaking." As he began to chant in a guttural, ancient language, the runes on the floor flared. The pain from the silver intensified, but it was different now. It was a pulling sensation, as if her very soul was being drawn out of her through the bond. She screamed, a thin, helpless sound. She could feel Kaelin's power being siphoned through her, feeding the dark ritual. She felt his strength faltering, his rage turning to agony. And then, the mountain exploded. A deafening boom shook the fortress to its foundations. A section of the cavern wall blew inward in a shower of rock and fire. And through the dust and chaos, he appeared. Kaelin. He was no longer a king. He was a god of wrath. His eyes were not silver, not gold, but blazing, pure, white fire. A low, continuous snarl was ripped from his chest, a sound that promised death. He was wounded, his arm bleeding, his face pale with exertion and the drain of the ritual, but he was a tempest of raw power. Behind him, his winter wolves poured into the cavern, their howls a symphony of vengeance. The battle was immediate and apocalyptic. The winter wolves crashed into the Ember Covenant acolytes. Steel rang, and the air filled with screams and the scent of blood. Kaelin ignored it all. His burning eyes were fixed on one person, Malachor. "You will release her," Kaelin snarled, his voice the grinding of tectonic plates. Malachor laughed, a high, triumphant sound. "You are too late, Wolf King. The bond is mine to command now." He thrust his hands toward the altar. "Watch her die. Feel your own soul unravel." A bolt of black energy shot from Malachor's hands, not at Kaelin, but at Alara. Kaelin roared, a sound of pure, soul-deep agony as he felt the attack through the bond. He stumbled, his hand flying to his chest, his own life force flickering like a guttering candle. He was vulnerable. The attack on her was an attack on him, and in that moment, something inside Alara snapped. Seeing him fall, seeing his magnificent strength brought low because of her, for her, it broke the dam. All the years of abuse from her pack, the humiliation from Lyra, the terror in the ravine, the agony of the silver, the despair in the dungeon, and now the protective, furious love she felt for the king who saw her when no one else would. All of it, the pain, the rage, the love, collided and ignited. The worthless, invisible Omega died on that altar, and a queen was born in fire. A light, brighter than the sun, more powerful than a star, exploded from her. It was not red or black magic. It was pure, white gold, the light of a newborn soul. It was the essence of life itself. The light slammed outward in a silent, unstoppable wave. It vaporized the black energy bolt mid-air. It shattered the silver manacles into dust. It disintegrated the black stone altar beneath her. The glowing red runes on the floor were scoured away, leaving clean, bare rock. The Ember Covenant acolytes screamed as the light washed over them, their dark magic turning to ash, their shadowy forms dissolving like smoke in the wind. The winter wolves, however, felt the light as a wave of warmth and strength, their wounds knitting closed, their exhaustion vanishing. Alara rose from the rubble of the altar, floating an inch above the floor. She was wreathed in a corona of blinding light, her plain brown hair now a swirling river of gold, her eyes shining with the same cosmic fire as Kaelin's. Power, immense and untamed, poured from her. The hidden wellspring within her soul, the dormant magic of a spirit weaver, a soul healer, had burst forth. Lord Malachor stared, his handsome face a mask of disbelief and terror. What are you?" he stammered, taking a step back. She looked at him, and her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper of an Omega. It was a chorus, a symphony of power that resonated in the very stone of the fortress. "You called me worthless," she said, the words a calm, lethal judgment. "You called me a key, a catalyst." She raised a hand, and a sphere of blinding light coalesced in her palm. "You were wrong." She extended her hand, and a beam of concentrated soul fire shot across the cavern. It did not burn Malachor. It did something far worse. It struck him, and his dark magic unraveled. The shadows clinging to him shrieked and fled. The unnatural youth and beauty bled from his face, leaving behind a withered, ancient husk. His violet eyes faded to a dull, terrified gray. The power he had stolen, the darkness he had cultivated for centuries, was simply gone. He collapsed to the floor, a powerless, broken old man, weeping in the sudden, brilliant light. Gunnar, Kaelin's second in command, stepped forward and ended the threat with a single, merciful stroke of his sword. The battle was over. The light around Alara slowly faded. The golden river of her hair softened back to its familiar brown. The cosmic fire receded from her eyes. The immense power that had flooded her senses drained away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. She swayed on her feet, the world tilting violently. Before she could fall, strong arms were around her. Kaelin. He held her, his grip tight, almost desperate. He was staring at her, his expression one of absolute, reverent awe. The white fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a molten gold that was brighter than ever. He was healed. Her light had healed him, had restored the power Malachor had siphoned, and then some. "Alara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He reached up and gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "You are magnificent." The words, so simple, so profound, broke through the last of her defenses. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief, of shock, of a joy so fierce it was painful. He saw her. He had seen her at her lowest, and now he had seen her at her most powerful, and his expression was the same, one of utter adoration. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of reverence. It was a promise, a homecoming. The bond between them flared, no longer a thin, aching thread, but a brilliant, unbreakable golden cord of light, singing with shared strength and love. He pulled back slightly and looked down at her hands. The place where the silver manacles had been was raw and red. He lifted her right hand, the one with the soul bond mark, and pressed a gentle kiss to the center of the wolf and star. The mark flared with a blinding golden light. A sharp, pleasant heat spread from it, and at the same time she felt a mirrored sensation from him. She looked down at his hand, which was still holding hers. There, on the back of his hand, a matching mark was burning itself into existence, a perfect mirror image of her own, the wolf and star etched onto the skin of the Alpha King. The bond was no longer just his claim on her. It was hers on him. It was a loop, a circuit, complete and absolute. She had, with her power and her will, claimed him back. "Mine," she whispered, the word tasting of destiny and rightness. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across Kaelin's face. It was like watching the sunrise after a long, dark night. "Yours," he confirmed, his voice a low, happy rumble. "Now and for all of time." The return to the main encampment, and then the journey to the king's capital city in the heart of the mountains, was a blur. News of the battle, of Lord Malachor's fall, and of the Luna's impossible power had spread like wildfire. The awe in the eyes of the winter wolves was now tinged with a healthy dose of fear. She was not just the king's fated mate. She was a power in her own right, a force of nature to rival him. When they arrived at the capital, a sprawling, beautiful city of white stone and soaring towers nestled in a high mountain valley, the streets were lined with wolves of every rank and station. They stared in silence as the royal procession passed, their eyes fixed on the small, brown-haired woman riding beside their king. Kaelin took her to the great citadel, a fortress of breathtaking scale and grace. He led her not to a guest chamber, but to his own royal apartments, a suite of rooms that overlooked the entire city. It was vast and lonely, and she knew, without him saying a word, that she was the first person to share it with him in half a millennium. That evening, he called a grand council in the throne room. Every alpha from every allied pack was there, including a pale and trembling Alpha Valerius. Lyra was not present. She had been confined to her tent after the abduction, a prisoner awaiting the king's justice. Kaelin stood before the great stone throne, but he did not sit. He waited until the hall was silent. Then he turned and held out his hand to Alara. She walked to his side, her heart hammering but her head held high. She was no longer afraid. He took her hand and raised it, turning it so the soul bond mark was visible to all. Then he raised his own, showing them its perfect twin. For 500 years, the throne of the Luna has been empty, Kaelin announced, his voice ringing with power and authority that left no room for argument. Today, it is filled. His golden eyes swept over the assembled alphas, finally landing on Valerius. You know her as Alara of the Silverwood Pack. An Omega you deemed worthless, an orphan you allowed to be abused and discarded. You were blind. He turned his gaze back to the whole assembly, his voice softening with pride and love. I know her as my soul's mate, the destroyer of the Ember Covenant, the light that saved us all. He looked down at her, his smile meant only for her. I present to you Alara, my mate, my queen. A collective gasp went through the hall, followed by a stunned, absolute silence. Then, Gunnar, commander of the Winter Wolves, drew his sword, raised it high, and roared, "To the Queen!" One by one, then in a great wave, every wolf in the hall, every proud alpha, every fierce warrior dropped to one knee. The sound of thousands of knees hitting the stone floor was a thunderous coronation. Even Valerius, his face ashen, sank to the ground, his head bowed in shame and terror. Alara stood beside her king, her hand in his, and looked out over the sea of bowed heads. She was not worthless. She was not invisible. She was a queen. She was a wolf. She was a storm of light and love. Later that night, she stood on the balcony of their rooms, the cool mountain air a soothing balm on her skin. The weight of her new reality was immense, a heavy crown of starlight and destiny. But it was not a crushing weight. Kaelin came to stand behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his warmth a solid, comforting presence. Is it too much? He asked softly, his breath stirring her hair. She thought of the cold stone floors, the icy water, the sting of Lyra's insults. She thought of the loneliness, the hunger, the gnawing belief that she was nothing. All of it seemed like a story from another life, a tale told about someone else. No, she whispered, leaning back into him. She placed her hands over his, their matching marks aligning, sending a gentle pulse of warmth between them. It feels like I can finally breathe. Below them, the lights of the capital city glittered like a fallen constellation. For the first time in her life, she was not looking in from the outside. She was not a shadow in the corner. She was at the very center of it all, held safe in the arms of a love as vast and ancient as the mountains themselves. She was home.